At 1:45 a.m. on May 11, 2025, the quiet night was shattered by desperate screams from a house at 10411 North Fallen Bow Drive in Houston, Texas. Shortly after, the 911 emergency hotline received a frantic call for help from inside the residence. The voice on the other end was weak and terrified, clearly injured and having experienced something horrific. The dispatcher could only hear the caller trembling as he said, "Please save my wife," before a series of terrifying sounds erupted through the phone. Sounds horrific enough to make anyone listening imagine the nightmare unfolding. The call was abruptly cut off. Just minutes later, the dispatch center received multiple emergency calls from residents living in the surrounding area. They frantically reported seeing a man carrying a weapon, stumbling around the yard, causing everyone to panic and immediately dial 911 for help. Recognizing the dangerous escalation, the dispatcher immediately relayed the information to the Houston Police Department to deploy emergency response units. Soon after, the wail of police sirens pierced the ominous atmosphere of the residential neighborhood. Bright headlights from patrol cars swept across the property, illuminating every dark corner around the house. Police officers cautiously approached, observing the situation step by step. Before them was a horrifying scene straight out of a horror movie. Right on the front porch, an elderly man was staggering from severe injuries, one hand trembling as he pressed against a wound gushing blood, the other arm holding a woman who had collapsed motionless, her body pale from excessive blood loss. A few steps away, in the middle of the yard, stood a bizarre man covered in blood, gripping a large knife in his hand. He stood defiantly, showing no fear at the police arrival, instead continuing to rant maniacally, hurling curses at the victims. Faced with such a dangerous individual, police immediately drew their weapons and shouted in unison for him to drop the knife. Without hesitation, they rushed to subdue him. Incredibly, the man offered no resistance, allowing police to tackle him, seize the weapon, and secure him in handcuffs. Once the situation was under control, medical teams were quickly dispatched to the scene to provide emergency care for the victims. At this point, the extent of both victims' injuries became clear. The motionless woman had suffered numerous stab and slash wounds across her body, blood soaking through her thin nightgown. Meanwhile, the elderly man, though bloodied about the head and torso, remained conscious, his eyes darting around in panic. Medical personnel immediately provided first aid, applied temporary bandages, and quickly loaded both victims into ambulances. In that chaotic moment, numerous questions plagued the minds of the officers present at the scene. Who had brutally attacked this elderly couple in their own home? The blood-covered man with the knife who had just been subdued was clearly suspicious, but what had driven him to such violence? To gradually unravel each mystery, the investigation team immediately began identifying the victims and tracing their social connections to narrow the circle of suspicion. The results showed that the woman lying in the pool of blood was Hoang Nguyen, 66 years old. According to friends, she was a gentle, loving woman who had devoted her entire life to her family. Everyone who knew her described her as a caring mother who loved her children and lived harmoniously within Houston's Vietnamese community. Her family had settled in America for many decades, maintaining Asian traditions while integrating with local life. Her husband was Dinh, 68 years old, the same person who had managed to call police for help before collapsing in blood. For years, the couple had lived kindly, bearing no grudges against anyone, with simple relationships limited to family and a few close friends. In their retirement years, they should have been enjoying their golden years surrounded by children and grandchildren, but tragically, disaster struck on Mother's Day, turning their peaceful home into hell in mere moments. When the victims' identities were confirmed, the investigation team immediately received devastating news from the hospital. Despite doctors' best efforts, Hoang Nguyen could not survive, taking her last breath around 6 a.m. on May 11th. Her passing left a painful void for her family and the entire community. The only small comfort was that Dinh was fortunate to keep his life, though he suffered serious injuries. Multiple trauma, numerous lacerations across his body, and severe head wounds from blunt force. Thanks to timely emergency care, he survived the critical period. But the pain of losing his wife after the tragedy remained an overwhelming shock. This loss only intensified police urgency to find the truth and uncover the mystery behind the brutal attack in this seemingly peaceful home. Initially, police conducted a thorough search of the entire house to rule out the possibility of stranger break-ins or multiple perpetrators. Results showed no signs of forced entry, windows remained intact, and no footprints or foreign objects from outside were discovered. All evidence pointed to an internal family conflict. The primary weapon was likely the large kitchen knife that police had confiscated from the yard. Additionally, in Truc Dinh's bedroom, they discovered a blood-stained metal dumbbell, which may have been the tool the suspect used to attack the elderly man. During evidence collection, the forensics team meticulously recorded every bloodstain and sign of struggle in the house. Analysis results showed that fingerprints and DNA samples matched completely with the man police had subdued at the scene. From this, his identity was clearly established: Hoang Dinh, 36 years old, the youngest son of both victims. He was born on June 2, 1988 in Vietnam, came to America with his parents as a child, and grew up in Houston's Vietnamese community. Acquaintances described Bao Dinh as a rather quiet boy with average academic performance. After completing high school, instead of pursuing college, he worked various manual labor jobs. His criminal record was completely clean, no significant prior arrests or convictions. According to neighbors, Bao Dinh still lived with his parents at the house on North Fallen Bao Drive. This family was known as hardworking, living simply, and had never had any conflicts with anyone. This stark contrast between this peaceful image and the brutal reality at the crime scene left investigators puzzled. The image of a man standing beside two victims with a weapon in hand, not even attempting to flee, was difficult to connect with the Bao Hoang Dinh that everyone knew. If they hadn't witnessed his arrest at the scene firsthand, perhaps no one could believe that Bao Hoang Dinh could become the prime suspect in such a shocking murder case. However, police worked solely on clear evidence. Analysis results showed Bao Dinh's DNA on both the bloody knife handle and the dumbbell. Moreover, after thoroughly examining the crime scene, experts found no signs indicating the presence of a third party. To understand the true sequence of this tragedy, the testimony of the only surviving witness, Truc Dinh, became the crucial key. When sufficiently alert to recount events, Truc Dinh tremblingly described every detail of that horrific night. He clearly remembered being deep in sleep when he suddenly felt repeated blows to his head with a heavy object. In panic, he struggled awake only to face his own son approaching with a knife. The excruciating pain caused him to instinctively cry out for his wife in the next room. Unexpectedly, this call for help became an invitation for death to visit the innocent woman. Hearing her husband's cries, Han Nguyen rushed downstairs to see what was happening. However, instead of receiving an explanation, she faced her son with crazed eyes, a tense expression, and a sharp knife in his hand. Without a word, without a moment's hesitation, in his frenzied state, Bao Dinh charged at his helpless and terrified mother. Truc Dinh could only watch his wife collapse in a pool of blood while he himself was exhausted, left with only desperate screams. With his last bit of strength, he tried to drag himself to the door, hoping his cries might attract neighbors' attention. Bao Dinh also stepped into the yard behind him, still gripping the blood-soaked weapon, lips continuously murmuring incomprehensible words. At that moment, police arrived just in time and subdued him. The consistent testimonies between the witness and crime scene evidence left no doubt. The perpetrator was Bao Hoang Dinh, the biological son of both victims. However, the motive remained a major question. Investigators found no record of serious family conflicts beforehand. Truc Dinh's household had no history of domestic violence. Neighbors had not heard any loud arguments the night before the incident. So, what had caused this 36-year-old man to suddenly attack his parents like this? Investigators began forming initial hypotheses. Could Bao Dinh have been using stimulants, or had simmering family conflicts accumulated to a breaking point? However, when they looked deeper into this individual, they received information that made these hypotheses fade. Family members described Bao Dinh as someone who lived quite privately, rarely sharing his thoughts with anyone, but had never shown violent behavior or engaged in heated arguments with his parents. Subsequent test results also completely ruled out the possibility that he had used drugs or alcohol at the time of the crime. Bao Din's system was completely clean. The more thoroughly investigators looked, the more they were led toward a different explanation, that he suffered from mental illness. The first signs supporting this hypothesis were noted from the moment police subdued the suspect. In the crime scene report, officers described Bao Din's behavior as extremely abnormal. He continuously mumbled unintelligible words and suddenly burst into inexplicable laughter, seemingly living in his own world. Notably, throughout the arrest process, he showed no concern for his parents' condition, instead continuously repeating meaningless phrases that no one could understand. Radio recordings between police units and emergency medical personnel also captured important observations. According to preliminary assessment at the scene, Bao Din was experiencing a severe acute mental crisis. Therefore, instead of following standard arrest procedures, authorities decided to prioritize taking him for mental health evaluation first. Only after being assessed by doctors and given sedatives to stabilize his condition was Bao Din transferred to the Harris County Detention Facility. A crucial turning point in the case came when Bao Din gradually became lucid and began answering questions after several hours of sedative treatment. In the interrogation room, his account left investigators stunned. Bao Ding insisted that everything he did stemmed from a divine dream, a vision so vivid that he believed it was reality. According to Bao Din's account, on that fateful night, he witnessed a horrifying vision of the future. A devastating world war was about to erupt. And in that desperate scenario, his parents had somehow become the focal point, the source of this global catastrophe. Not stopping there, the dream also brought him a sacred revelation, a voice or message that appeared clearly in his mind, commanding him that to save humanity from disaster, he must take decisive action immediately, eliminate the very people who had given birth to him. When he woke in the middle of the night, instead of recognizing it as just a nightmare, Bao Din completely believed in this strange mission with almost fanatical faith. In that abnormal psychological state, he systematically prepared tools to carry out the task, a knife from the kitchen and a dumbbell already available in the house. In a state of extreme paranoia, the boundary between reality and hallucination had completely dissolved in Bao Din's mind. He entered his father's bedroom with mechanical, emotionless movements. According to his cold account, when Truc Din awoke and reacted by struggling and screaming, Bao Din felt obstructed in carrying out his mission, so he switched to using the knife to solve the problem. When he heard his mother's voice from outside, he turned and saw Hat Nguyen standing at the bottom of the stairs with a horrified expression. Without a moment's hesitation, he rushed down and attacked the woman who had given birth to him with unbelievable cruelty, all carried out with a single purpose in his twisted mind: completing the mission to save the world. These chilling accounts made even veteran investigators shudder at the suspect's callousness and diseased thinking. Notably, after committing the brutal act, Bao Din showed no panic or intention to escape. Instead, he went outside as if waiting for recognition of his achievement, his mind still completely controlled by the delusion from his dream that he had saved humanity from catastrophe. This deeply disturbed confession helped investigators understand the true nature of the case. There was no traditional motive like money, personal hatred, or family conflict. Everything simply stemmed from severe mental illness, where hallucinations and paranoid beliefs had led a son to unforgivable actions against the very people who had brought him into the world and raised him. To examine whether Bao Din was influenced by external factors, police thoroughly checked all his personal technology devices, from computers and phones to social media accounts. The goal was to determine if he had been exposed to extremist propaganda, conspiracy theories, or brainwashed by fanatical religious organizations. However, investigation results showed no evidence of these external influences in Bao Din's life. This further confirmed the assessment that the incident entirely stemmed from an internal mental crisis. To gain a more comprehensive view, the investigation team expanded their survey to those around Bao Din, from childhood friends to recent co-workers. Through these interviews, a picture gradually emerged. In recent times, Bao Ding had shown signs of depression. increasingly withdrawing into his own world and avoiding social activities. However, none of his acquaintances could have imagined that these relatively mild psychological changes could lead to such a horrific tragedy. The mental illness may have crept in and developed silently over a long period without being detected and treated in time. Forensic psychiatrists invited to participate in the evaluation process provided a preliminary diagnosis. Bao Dinh likely suffered from acute paranoid disorder or symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia. These disorders can cause patients to hear voices in their heads and act on instructions from hallucinations with complete trust. While this cannot excuse the brutal nature of his actions, from a medical perspective, it's understandable that Bao Dinh had become a victim of his own mental illness, a disease that had accumulated and escalated beyond control. Tragically, the people he loved most became victims of that mental breakdown. Based on all physical evidence, witness testimony, and especially the detailed confession of the suspect himself, investigators were able to accurately reconstruct the sequence of that fateful night. On the evening of May 10th, life in the modest home of Truc Dinh's family on North Fallen Bao Drive continued at its familiar pace. Hat Nguyen had gone to bed early, planning to wake up early to prepare special dishes for the upcoming Mother's Day. Truc Dinh, following his nightly routine, stayed in his room to read scriptures before sleeping. As for Bao Hoang Dinh, after a normal day, he had also retired to his room. However, in the dark silence of his room, Bao Dinh's mind began to be invaded by strange thoughts and nameless anxieties. He tossed and turned in bed, trying to push away the bizarre ideas gradually taking over his mind. Eventually, exhaustion led him to sleep, but that was when the real nightmare began. In that sinister dream, he saw the world consumed by the chaos of war. What made him even more horrified was realizing that at the center of this global tragedy were the two people he loved most, his own parents. Though completely illogical in that dream world, Bao Dinh somehow understood that his parents were the source, and without preventive action, an even darker future awaited humanity. At that moment, an unidentifiable voice echoed in his mind, clear and decisive. To save the world from catastrophe, Bao Dinh must sacrifice the very people who had given birth to him. At 1:30 a.m. on May 11th, 2025, Bao Dinh jolted awake in panic, his entire body drenched in cold sweat after the intense nightmare. However, instead of feeling relieved upon realizing it was just a dream, his disturbed mind interpreted it as a divine revelation, a warning from a supernatural power about what was to come. In this abnormal psychological state, he completely believed that the only way to prevent global catastrophe was to carry out the mission the dream had entrusted to him. From that moment, Bao Hoang Dinh switched to action mode with chilling coldness and determination. In the silence of the late night, Bao Dinh began implementing his horrific plan. He quietly went downstairs to the kitchen, carefully withdrawing from the knife rack a large chef's knife with an 8-inch blade. However, in his disturbed mind, he felt he needed an additional, more effective tool to complete the mission. He remembered the dumbbells his father regularly used during morning workouts. With stealthy steps, Bao Dinh entered the living room and picked up a metal weight of about 11 pounds. With 2 weapons in hand, he silently approached his parents' bedroom. In the dim light of the late night, he could see Truc Dinh sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the approaching danger. Bao Dinh moved close to the bedside, raised the dumbbell with both hands, and aimed directly at his father's head. The sound of metal striking bone shattered the night's tranquility. Truc Dinh jolted awake in excruciating pain, cries of agony escaping his lips, but the attack didn't stop. Bao Dinh continued striking with the dumbbell repeatedly. Following survival instincts, Truc Dinh raised his hands trying to shield himself, struggling and rolling off the bed in desperation. Seeing his target trying to escape his reach, the frenzy within Bao Dinh intensified. He threw the dumbbell aside and drew the prepared knife. With the vacant stare of someone who had completely lost control, Bao Dinh lunged at his father lying on the floor. Consecutive stab wounds pierced Truc Dinh's shoulder, chest, and ribs. Fresh blood began spreading across the floor. In ultimate pain and desperation, he tried to summon his last bit of strength to call for help from his wife in the adjacent room. Han Nguyen, also sleeping, was startled awake by the loud noise when her husband was attacked. But only when she heard his screams calling her name did she truly understand something terrible was happening. A wife and mother's intuition caused her to rush out of her room, running toward the staircase where the sounds originated. She ran while turning on the hallway light, and the nightmare scene struck her eyes. The mother's scream caused Bao Dinh to whip around. Seeing his mother, he charged straight at her without hesitation. Hat tried to turn and run but couldn't escape in time. Bao Dinh knocked his mother down to the floor. He pinned the 66-year-old woman to the ground and then repeatedly stabbed her chest and abdomen. The poor mother only managed one agonized scream before gradually losing consciousness. Blood from the deep wounds soaked the carpet where she lay. Having completed his brutal mission, Bao Dinh stood there in a daze, breathing heavily. At that moment, the faint groans of Truc Dinh echoed from the bedroom. Bao Dinh returned to the room to see his father still struggling. He approached intending to finish him off, but just then police sirens wailed in the distance, along with blue and red lights flashing through the windows. Truc Dinh used all his strength to drag his wounded body following his son, trying to reach the yard to call for help. The front door burst open as Bao Dinh rushed into the yard. 2 patrol cars had already arrived in front of the house. Seeing the police lights, Bao Dinh didn't flee but stood frozen in the yard, still holding the knife. Truc Dinh also staggered onto the porch, collapsing on the front lawn just a few yards from his son. Police immediately moved in, controlled the situation, and transported the victims for emergency care. 4 hours after the attack, Han Nguyen died at the hospital due to acute blood loss and severe internal organ damage. Doctors confirmed she passed away around 6 a.m., turning Mother's Day 2025 into a day of mourning for the family. Truc Dinh was more fortunate, undergoing emergency surgery for his wounds and surviving the critical period. At the same time, in the interrogation room at Houston Police Department, Bao Dinh had regained some lucidity after the frenzy thanks to sedatives. He was informed of his mother's death and his father's critical condition. Bao Dinh's reaction was strangely detached, showing no emotion or remorse like a normal person would. He only said one sentence that chilled the police: "Has World War III been prevented yet?" With sufficient physical evidence and testimony from all parties, the case was quickly entered into criminal proceedings. Bao Hoang Dinh was detained at Harris County Jail awaiting trial. The preliminary hearing took place on the evening of May 11th. However, Bao Dinh did not appear in court directly that day due to his still unstable mental condition. The defendant was connected remotely, and the judge had to read the case file without the defendant present. Bao Hoang Dinh was charged with 2 counts: murder and aggravated assault of family members with a deadly weapon. The preliminary hearing judge described this case as particularly serious and dangerous to the community, as the perpetrator was willing to attack family members during a psychotic episode. The court decided to hold Bao Dinh without bail, setting an extremely high bail amount. The total bail was initially set at $5 million. The judge justified this record-high bail amount as necessary to ensure community safety, as Bao Dinh posed a threat to society if released during the pre-trial period. The focus of this case shifted to questions of criminal responsibility and Bao Hoang Dinh's mental capacity. The court-appointed defense attorney for Bao Hoang requested that the court allow a psychiatric evaluation of his client. This is a common step in cases where the defendant shows signs of mental illness. Under Texas law, if a defendant is determined to lack behavioral capacity or suffer from severe mental illness at the time of the crime, they may be considered not guilty by reason of insanity due to loss of behavioral control. However, this does not mean they would be released. Instead, the defendant may be required to undergo mandatory treatment at a psychiatric hospital for an extended period, potentially for life. Bao Dinh's psychological state in the days following the incident was quite abnormal, sometimes lucid, sometimes panicking and screaming in his cell. Forensic psychiatrists were invited by the court to evaluate, and initial assessment results showed Bao Dinh exhibited signs of schizophrenia. It's expected that during court arguments, the prosecution will need to prove that the defendant was aware of wrongdoing when committing the crime, while the defense attorney may choose a mental health defense strategy, arguing the defendant lacked cognitive capacity due to illness to avoid the death penalty. In June 2025, Harris County's grand jury convened and formally indicted Hoang Dinh on the alleged charges. This paved the way for the county-level criminal trial to take place in the near future. According to the preliminary court schedule, Dinh will have his next appearance on September 2nd, 2025, which is about a month away. There he will have to enter his plea, guilty or not guilty. The attorney will likely enter a not guilty plea and propose a mental health defense. If the court accepts this, the case will shift toward determining whether Hoang Dinh was mentally ill at the time of the crime. In the opposite case, if determined to have sufficient capacity to bear responsibility, he will face a trial with all the incriminating evidence that has been collected. Penalties for murder in Texas are very serious. The maximum sentence is life imprisonment, and the minimum is about 15 years in prison. The charge of aggravated assault of a family member with a weapon could add up to 25 years in prison. The Harris County prosecutor stated they will pursue this case to the fullest extent due to its savage nature and the shock it caused to the community. However, the final verdict may depend on multiple psychiatric evaluation results. Nevertheless, the formal trial is expected to not take place before the end of this year due to the time needed to complete evaluations and prepare the case file. Currently, Dinh is being held in Block G09 of Harris County Jail awaiting his court date. And that concludes today's case. Thank you for following along, and we'll see you in the next videos.